The crew of the Ardent was in shock. This was no ordinary human ship. It wasn't just a simple rebellion. The humans had something they didn't understand, something more powerful than they had ever imagined. As the Vanguard continued to strike, it became clear the fight had only just begun, and the Empire had made a grave mistake by underestimating humanity. Thrax stood from his chair, his anger burning hotter. Prepare for a full-scale assault. This ends now. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't just the beginning of a battle. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Humanity had just proven that they were capable of far more than the Empire ever thought possible. And the Vanguard was only the beginning. The Empire strikes back. The battle raged on in the cold void of space. The Vanguard, humanity's lone ship, darted between the Empire's fleet, dodging their attacks with ease. Every time one of the Empire's warships tried to lock on, the Vanguard was already out of range, its movements fluid and almost unnatural. No one on the Ardent could comprehend how such a small vessel was causing so much damage. The Empire's ships were powerful, but they were slow and predictable compared to this human ship. Admiral Thrax watched in disbelief as his fleet faltered. His officers scrambled to regain control, issuing orders that seemed to have little effect. The human ship, the Vanguard, had turned the tide. It had already destroyed 2 support ships, and now it was heading straight for the Ardent. Thrax clenched his fists in anger. His pride as the Empire's greatest military mind was being shattered by a single human vessel. The Ardent was the flagship of the Empire, the symbol of its unassailable might. How could this be happening? "Admiral, we need to retreat," suggested one of his officers, her voice shaky with fear. "The Vanguard is too powerful for us to take on alone." "No," Thrax snapped, his voice cold. "We will not run from a human ship. We will destroy it." He stood up from his command chair, his eyes locked onto the display showing the Vanguard's movements. His fleet had to respond. If the Vanguard was allowed to continue its assault, it would break their will. The entire galaxy would see that the Empire could be challenged. That could not happen. "Bring the fleet together," Thrax ordered. "Focus fire on that ship. No more mistakes." The fleet's formation shifted, and every ship turned to face the Vanguard. The Ardent led the charge, its massive weapons systems coming online, ready to unleash a devastating barrage. The smaller ships followed suit, their own weapons charging as they prepared to take down their elusive target. The Vanguard, however, showed no signs of slowing down. It moved like lightning, cutting through the Empire's fleet with terrifying precision. It wasn't just avoiding the blasts. It was turning the tables. Its weapons systems fired back with deadly force, sending shockwaves through the Empire's ships. Thrax's eyes widened as another blast from the Vanguard hit one of his cruisers, tearing it apart in an instant. The Empire's losses were mounting, and Thrax knew he couldn't afford to lose more ships. The balance of power was shifting, and the Ardent couldn't hold back forever. "Prepare the heavy artillery," Thrax barked. "We will destroy it now." The Ardent's main cannons powered up, charging with energy as they focused all their fire on the human ship. A massive beam of energy shot from the Ardent, cutting through the vacuum of space toward the Vanguard. For a moment, the human ship seemed to slow, its engines barely visible as the blast approached. But then, in the blink of an eye, the Vanguard accelerated, dodging the beam at the last possible moment. The blast missed, narrowly avoiding the Vanguard and striking one of the Empire's destroyers instead. The ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light. Admiral Thrax's fury intensified. Every time he thought he had the upper hand, the Vanguard proved him wrong. It was too fast, too clever. It was almost as if it knew the Empire's moves before they made them. Then the Vanguard did something Thrax hadn't anticipated. It vanished. For a moment, there was silence. The Vanguard was no longer visible on the radar. Had it been destroyed? Had it finally met its match? Where did it go? Thrax demanded, his eyes scanning the display frantically. "Report," Where is it? The officer at the radar station was shaking his head, unable to answer. It's gone. It just disappeared. For a long moment, the Empire's fleet hung in the void, waiting, unsure of what to do next. Thrax's mind raced, trying to understand what had just happened. How could a ship so small and so fast simply vanish without a trace? But just as the fleet began to regroup, the answer came. From behind the fleet, the Vanguard appeared again. It had flanked them, moving with such speed that no one had noticed. Without hesitation, the human ship fired another blast, hitting the Ardent directly. The blast caused a massive explosion on the Ardent's outer hull, sending shockwaves through the flagship. The crew was thrown from their seats as alarms blared, and smoke filled the air. The Empire's flagship was now under attack, and Thrax realized with horror that the Vanguard had taken them by surprise. Thrax gritted his teeth. His pride was on the line, and he would not let a human ship destroy everything he had worked for. He slammed his fist down on the console. All ships, full assault, destroy that vessel. But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. The Vanguard was more than just a ship. It was a symbol of everything the Empire had underestimated about humanity. And the battle was far from over. The Empire's desperation. Admiral Thrax stood in the command center of the Ardent, his mind spinning. The Vanguard had struck again, and the damage was far worse than he had expected. The blast had torn through the Ardent's outer hull, causing massive casualties. Fires burned in several sections of the flagship, and emergency systems were barely keeping the ship intact. Thrax gritted his teeth in frustration. The Empire's might was being challenged by a single human vessel, and that was something that could not be allowed. "Sir, we've lost several of our support ships," an officer reported, her voice trembling. "The Vanguard is too fast. It's taking out our ships one by one." Thrax's hands clenched into fists. He had seen many battles in his career, but nothing like this. He had always been the one in control, the one commanding fleets that brought entire worlds to their knees. But now, a single human ship was turning the tide, and he was powerless to stop it. "What do you propose, Admiral?" another officer asked, his voice unsure. "Our current tactics aren't working. The Vanguard has a weapon unlike anything we've seen. We need a new plan." Thrax's mind raced. What was he missing? There had to be something. His fleet had superior firepower, superior numbers, yet every time they launched an attack, the Vanguard was already gone, its weapons tearing through their ships with unerring precision. It was clear the human ship knew how to anticipate their moves. He glanced at the damage reports again. The Ardent was still operational, but it wouldn't last much longer if the battle continued like this. Thrax took a deep breath, pushing aside his frustration. He needed to think clearly. "We're not going to win by chasing the Vanguard," he said finally, his voice cold and determined. "We need to draw it in, lure it into a trap." The officers around him exchanged confused looks. "A trap, sir?" "Yes," Thrax said, his eyes narrowing. "We've underestimated this human ship's capabilities, but we know one thing. It can't destroy the entire fleet on its own. It has to come to us. And when it does, we'll be ready." He turned to his communication officer. "Send a message to the fleet. Begin a retreat. We will give the Vanguard an opening, make it think it has the advantage. When it moves in for the kill, we'll spring our trap." The officers hesitated. "Retreat, sir?" one officer asked. "But we'll be leaving ourselves vulnerable." Thrax's eyes burned with a cold fire. "We will be in control. The Vanguard will follow us, thinking we're fleeing. And when it does, we'll surround it. The Empire's fleet will finish it off." The officer nodded slowly, but there was still doubt in their eyes. Thrax didn't care. This was their only option. Meanwhile, the Vanguard continued to weave through the Empire's forces, picking off their ships one by one. Captain Eris, who had taken command of the Vanguard, watched the battle unfold on the main screen, her expression focused. She could feel the tension in the air, the growing uncertainty of the Empire's fleet. This was the moment they had been waiting for, but they couldn't let their guard down. The Empire was desperate, and desperation often led to reckless actions. "Captain, they're retreating," reported one of the officers. Eris frowned. "What?" "They're pulling back, Captain. The Empire's fleet is regrouping. It looks like they're trying to form a new battle line." A sinking feeling began to form in Eris's gut. The Empire was known for its cunning, and this retreat seemed too coordinated. It didn't feel right. "Keep your eyes open," she said, her voice steady but alert. "The Empire might be trying to lure us into a trap." The crew of the Vanguard was tense, their eyes darting between the monitors as the Empire's fleet began to pull away. They were retreating, but not in a disorganized fashion. The ships were moving in a way that suggested a hidden agenda. Eris wasn't foolish enough to believe they were simply giving up. The Empire had lost too much already, and their pride wouldn't let them retreat without a plan. "Do we follow?" one of the officers asked. Eris didn't answer right away. She stared at the retreating fleet. It seemed like a perfect opportunity to strike again, to take out the remaining ships before they could regroup. But something wasn't right. "They want us to follow," Eris finally said. "They're trying to bait us in." The officers exchanged nervous glances, but Eris stood firm. "We're not taking the bait. Keep our distance. Watch them closely. If they're setting a trap, we'll find it." But even as she spoke those words, she knew that the Empire was not just retreating. They were planning something. And whatever it was, it wouldn't be good for the Vanguard. Back on the Ardent, Thrax watched the human ship carefully. He knew that he had to keep up the ruse. His fleet had to look weak, vulnerable, and ready to flee. He couldn't afford to let the Vanguard catch on to his plan. If the human ship moved in for the kill, they would be waiting. "We'll lure them in," Thrax muttered to himself, his grip tightening on the console. "And when they come, we'll strike." The final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. The Empire's fleet was retreating, deceptively but effectively, and the Vanguard was about to walk straight into their trap. But in the back of Thrax's mind, a warning nagged at him. The Vanguard was unlike anything the Empire had ever faced. What if the trap failed? What if the human ship was more than they had ever imagined? The tension was building. The Vanguard was watching the Empire's retreat closely, waiting for the right moment. The Empire's fleet had underestimated humanity once before. Would they do it again? And when the trap was set, would the Empire's fleet be able to handle the wrath of Earth's revenge? The stakes had never been higher. The trap closes in. The Vanguard hung just outside the Empire's retreat, its sleek silhouette cutting through the darkness of space. Captain Eris stood in the command center, her eyes focused on the enemy fleet that had pulled back in a disciplined formation. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to strike. But Eris wasn't fooled. The Empire was known for its cunning, and this retreat wasn't what it appeared to be. "Keep your distance," Eris commanded. "Don't follow too closely. We wait for them to make their move." Her crew followed her orders with nervous precision. Everyone knew the risks. The Empire wasn't retreating out of fear. They were playing a game of deception. And the longer they waited, the more dangerous it became. Across the galaxy, aboard the Ardent, Admiral Thrax's mind raced. His plan was coming together. The Vanguard was following them, just as he had hoped. The human ship's crew couldn't resist the lure of an easy victory. They would move in for the kill, thinking the Empire was in full retreat. But when they did, the Empire's elite fleet would close in and destroy the intruder. "It's almost time," Thrax muttered to himself. He paced the command deck, his boots clicking against the metal floor. Every part of him was on edge. But he had no choice. If this plan failed, his fleet would be lost, and so would his career. "Admiral, the human ship is closing in," an officer reported, her voice tight with anxiety. "It's moving faster than expected. They're making a move." Thrax smiled coldly. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The Vanguard was about to fall into the trap. The crew of the Vanguard could sense the tension rising as they watched the Empire's retreating fleet. Eris had given the order to hold position, but every second spent in this standoff only seemed to make the situation more dangerous. The Empire wasn't retreating out of fear. They were playing a game, and they wanted humanity to chase after them. "Captain, their fleet is starting to slow down," one officer said, his voice full of suspicion. "It looks like they're setting up a defensive perimeter. Should we engage?" Eris hesitated. The situation was too quiet, too calculated. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "No," she said firmly. "Hold your fire. We're not falling for this." But the silence was deafening. Every officer in the room could feel the unease building. The Vanguard was waiting, circling just outside the Empire's line, watching for any sign of movement. And then, without warning, the Empire's fleet shifted into position. It was subtle at first, just a slight movement in their formation. But then it became clear. The retreat had been a ruse. They had drawn the Vanguard in. "Captain," shouted the officer at the sensors, "the Empire's fleet is turning on us. It's a trap." Eris' heart sank. She had been right to hesitate. The Empire had lured them in, and now they were surrounded. The Empire's elite fleet had circled around the Vanguard, cutting off any escape routes. They were trapped in the middle of enemy forces, with no way out. "Raise shields. Prepare to engage," Eris ordered, her voice calm but filled with urgency. "We're not going down without a fight." The Empire's fleet closed in. The Ardent led the charge, its weapons primed and ready to strike. Thrax watched with cold satisfaction as the human ship was surrounded. It was only a matter of time now. "Fire at will," Thrax commanded, his voice booming over the comms. The first blast tore through the Vanguard's shields, sending shockwaves throughout the ship. The crew braced themselves as the ship rocked under the impact. But the Vanguard didn't falter. Its engines roared to life, and it darted out of the way, narrowly avoiding another barrage. "Return fire," Eris shouted. "Target their weak points." The Vanguard's weapons lit up the darkness of space, sending precise shots toward the Empire's fleet. But they were heavily outnumbered. For every shot that hit, there were 10 more aimed in return. The Vanguard was taking heavy damage. Eris gritted her teeth, her hands gripping the command console. This was the most dangerous fight they had ever been in. The Empire was relentless, and the Vanguard was surrounded. But Eris wasn't about to give up. Humanity had come too far, and this was their moment to show the galaxy what they were capable of. "Get us out of here," Eris yelled. "Warp drive. Now." The crew worked furiously, punching in commands. But it was too late. Another blast hit the Vanguard's engines, sending a jolt through the ship. The crew was thrown off balance, but Eris remained steady. "Captain, we're losing power," an officer shouted. "The warp drive is offline." Eris' eyes widened in realization. They were stuck, and the Empire was closing in for the kill. On the Ardent, Thrax's gaze never wavered. His fleet was closing in, and the Vanguard was barely holding together. The trap was working perfectly. But even as he gave the command for another barrage, a small part of him began to wonder. The human ship had taken hit after hit, yet it still fought back, still resisted. There was something about the Vanguard that made Thrax uneasy. He had seen many ships crumble under pressure, but this one was different. It was surviving against all odds. Thrax dismissed the thought. There was no time for doubt. The Empire would not lose. Not today. In the heart of the Vanguard, Eris refused to surrender. She stared at the damage reports, her mind racing for a solution. They couldn't escape. No, not yet. But they weren't going to let the Empire win either. "Prepare the last-ditch plan," Eris said, her voice filled with resolve. "We're going to show the Empire what humanity can do." The crew exchanged glances. They had come this far, and they weren't going to stop now. Whatever it took, they would fight until the end. The unexpected turn. Captain Eris stood at the helm of the Vanguard, watching as the Empire's fleet pressed in. The tension in the command room was palpable. They had expected a trap, but this was beyond anything they had prepared for. The enemy's numbers were overwhelming, their ships closing in, their weapons primed for the kill. The Vanguard had already taken a beating, its shields flickering under the constant barrage. Eris gripped the command console with white knuckles. "Get those shields back online, now," she barked. "We're trying, Captain," shouted the officer at the control panel. "But the damage is too extensive. The power's fluctuating." "We're not giving up yet," Eris said with a determination that rang through the room. Her voice was calm, but everyone could hear the steel beneath it. "We need to buy more time. Evasive maneuvers, now." The Vanguard jerked and swerved, narrowly avoiding another salvo from the Empire's elite fleet. The ship groaned under the stress, but it held together. It always held together. The Vanguard darted toward the dense asteroid field that loomed nearby. The plan was risky, but it was the only chance they had. If they could just make it into the field, they could use the asteroids as cover to evade the Empire's fire. It wasn't a foolproof plan, but humanity had learned long ago that sometimes survival meant taking risks. "We can't outrun them in open space," Eris muttered under her breath. "But maybe we can outsmart them." As the Vanguard entered the asteroid field, the ship seemed to come alive. The crew worked in perfect synchronization, adjusting their trajectory with precision. The asteroids loomed large, a chaotic maze of rock and debris. The Empire's fleet wasn't as maneuverable in the tight space, and it was clear that the humans had the advantage. But even as they raced through the field, dodging incoming fire and weaving between massive asteroids, Eris knew this wouldn't last long. The Empire wasn't stupid. They would adapt. The Vanguard had bought a moment, but that was all it was, a moment. And moments like these were fleeting. "We're not out of this yet," Eris said, her voice steady but urgent. "What's the status on the warp drive?" The officer at the control panel turned to face her, his face pale. "Still offline, Captain. We can't escape. The damage is too extensive." Eris exhaled sharply, frustration and desperation beginning to seep through her calm demeanor. They were trapped. No way to fight back. No way to escape. The Vanguard was a sitting duck in the middle of the Empire's trap, and every passing second seemed to draw them closer to their doom. But then, a sudden thought struck her. The Empire's fleet wasn't just pressing in. They were overextending. In their eagerness to finish them off, the Empire was leaving gaps in their formation, areas where the Vanguard could slip through. "Hold steady," Eris commanded. "Don't let up on the evasive maneuvers, but look for openings." Her crew worked frantically, scanning the surrounding space. The Empire was closing in tighter, but the Vanguard's quick movements and small size allowed it to slip through gaps between the enemy ships, narrowly avoiding collisions with the massive warships. Each maneuver was more daring than the last, but Eris knew that this was their only shot. Then, with a sudden lurch, the ship's systems flickered, and the status screen showed a drastic change. "Captain," shouted the officer, "we've regained partial control of the warp drive. It's not much, but it's enough to give us a fighting chance." Eris' heart leaped in her chest. This was the break they needed. The Vanguard might be damaged, but it wasn't done yet. With the Empire closing in, the Vanguard was about to turn the tables on them. "Get us out of here, now," Eris barked. The ship's engines hummed as the crew worked swiftly to reroute the power and stabilize the warp drive. The time had come to make their move. In the midst of the chaos, a shocking realization hit Eris like a bolt of lightning. The Empire had underestimated humanity's resilience. They had been counting on a quick victory, assuming that the Vanguard would break under the pressure. But instead, the humans had survived. And now they were striking back with a new kind of fury. For a moment, the Vanguard seemed like it was about to give up, to fall into the trap the Empire had set. But Eris had always believed that humanity was more than just the sum of its parts, and this was proof. They hadn't just endured, they were about to prove their strength. With a surge of energy, the Vanguard lurched forward, its warp engines humming louder than ever before. The ship shot through the gap in the enemy fleet, pushing through the chaos of space at blinding speed. But the Empire wasn't finished yet. Their pursuit would be relentless. "Prepare for battle," Eris ordered. "We're not running anymore. We're going to show them what humans are capable of." The Vanguard tore through space, and the first signs of victory started to glimmer on the horizon. The battle was far from over, but one thing was clear. Humanity had turned the tide, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. The Empire's miscalculation. As the Vanguard sped through the vastness of space, the tension in the command room had shifted from desperation to determination. The crew, battered and bruised, stood united, waiting for their next move. Captain Eris, still at the helm, had a sharp look in her eyes. This was their moment. The Empire had underestimated humanity, and now it was time to make them pay for it. "We've made it through the gap, Captain," one of the officers reported. "The fleet is in pursuit, but they're slower now." "They weren't expecting us to pull this off." Eris nodded. She knew they hadn't escaped just yet. The Empire's fleet was massive, and their enemies would not stop until they saw the Vanguard destroyed. But the humans had proven their resilience. They had survived the initial ambush, and now they had the Empire's attention. "Focus on the rear scanners," Eris commanded. "I want to know if they've made any changes in their formation." The officer nodded, adjusting the readings. For a moment, the crew was focused, watching the glowing lines of the scanner. They knew they were running out of time. "Captain, they've adjusted," the officer said, urgency creeping into his voice. "The Empire is sending reinforcements to intercept us. They're preparing for a full-scale pursuit." Eris felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The Vanguard was still damaged, and they didn't have much in the way of firepower left. But she also knew something else. Humanity wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for revenge. And revenge was a powerful motivator. "We're not running anymore," Eris said with a grim determination. "We've got them right where we want them." The Vanguard wasn't just a ship. It had become a symbol of humanity's ability to rise from the ashes, to turn the tables when the odds were against them. Eris wasn't going to let the Empire crush that spirit. "We're going to hit them before they have a chance to regroup," Eris continued, her eyes scanning the display in front of her. "Get the forward guns online. It's time they learned what it means to underestimate humanity." The officer at the weapons console worked quickly, sweat dripping from his forehead. "Aye, Captain. Weapons coming online." Eris gripped the edge of the command console, her mind racing. The Vanguard had only one shot at this, one chance to strike before the Empire's reinforcements arrived. If they failed, they would be overwhelmed. "We've got a narrow window," Eris said, her voice low but fierce. "Once we take out their lead ships, we'll have the advantage. That's when we make our move." With the Vanguard's weapons finally online, Eris barked orders to her crew, each of them moving with precision. They knew what they had to do. The ship was damaged, its shields still barely holding, but the humans were ready. They weren't about to let the Empire finish them off without a fight. As the Vanguard turned back toward the oncoming Empire ships, a quiet determination filled the crew. They had nothing to lose, and that, in many ways, was the most dangerous thing of all. "Captain," the officer said, "the enemy ships are coming into range. We can hit them now." Eris took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. They had no idea if this would work. But if they didn't try, the consequences would be far worse than failure. The Vanguard needed to make its move now. "Do it," Eris commanded. The ship's weapons fired, the blasts of energy cutting through the blackness of space like lightning. The lead Empire ships rocked under the sudden assault, shields cracking and hulls buckling. The Empire's fleet was thrown into disarray, and the crew of the Vanguard cheered, feeling the brief, sweet taste of victory. But Eris knew better. This battle was far from over. "Don't let up," she said. "Keep them on their toes. We need to force them into a position where they can't escape." The Vanguard's guns fired again, hitting their marks with deadly precision. The Empire's lead ships were now crippled, but their reinforcements were closing in fast. The fight was shifting, and the humans were making their stand. Captain Eris' mind raced as she looked over the battlefield. The Empire had made a grave miscalculation. They had thought the humans would fall, but they had underestimated humanity's spirit, its capacity to fight back. For a fleeting moment, Eris allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the turning point. Humanity's secret armada was no longer just a dream or a myth. It was real, and it was striking back in the most unexpected way possible. The Vanguard wasn't just a ship now. It was the tip of humanity's spear, and the Galactic Empire had made the mistake of thinking it was just another target. "Get ready," Eris said, her voice steady, her resolve hardening. "We've just begun, and the Empire is about to learn the cost of underestimating us." The final battle was approaching, and the Vanguard was about to take the fight to the heart of the Empire. Humanity was no longer on the back foot. They were ready to make their mark. The shocking victory. The battle had reached its peak. The Vanguard, battered but unyielding, stood as humanity's last hope against the might of the Galactic Empire. The Empire had sent its elite fleet, believing they could crush the humans once and for all. But what they hadn't counted on was the sheer determination of a single human ship, standing tall against their overwhelming force. Captain Eris stood at the helm, eyes fixed on the enemy fleet. The Vanguard had dealt severe damage, but its shields were flickering, and its weapons systems were strained. The reinforcements the Empire had sent were fierce, but the humans had the element of surprise, and a willingness to fight that no alien fleet had ever faced before. "We're almost out of time, Captain," reported her weapons officer, his voice tense. "They're coming in hot, and our defenses won't hold much longer." Eris' heart raced, but she didn't let the fear show. She had led her crew through impossible odds before. This wouldn't be the first time they had defied the expectations of the galaxy. "We have one last shot," Eris said, her voice low and determined. "Target their flagship. If we take that down, the rest of the fleet will scatter." The crew of the Vanguard worked in perfect unison, despite their exhaustion. The crew had been through so much already, yet they remained focused, their resolve unwavering. They knew this was their final chance. If they failed, it would mean the end. The flagship of the Empire loomed ahead, a colossal warship bristling with weapons and defensive systems. The Empire had spared no expense in creating a symbol of its power. It was the perfect target. Eris watched as her gunnery officer locked onto the ship's most vulnerable point, a section of the hull that had been damaged in the earlier skirmish. "Fire when ready," Eris ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. The Vanguard's weapons charge, a pulse of energy that sliced through the black void of space and slammed into the flagship. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then a massive explosion rocked the Empire's vessel as the blast hit its weak point. The enemy flagship shuddered violently, its shields failing as the energy blast penetrated deep into its core. The ship groaned under the assault, and then, with a deafening roar, it detonated, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. Pieces of the massive warship were flung into the void, scattering like debris in a storm. Eris stood still for a moment, watching the destruction unfold. The sound of her crew's triumphant cheers echoed around her, but she knew better than to get too comfortable. The victory, while immense, was still fragile. "Hold your positions," Eris barked. "We're not done yet. Prepare for the next phase." The remaining Empire ships began to retreat, their leadership in chaos. The destruction of the flagship had shattered the cohesion of the fleet. Without their central command vessel, they had no clear direction. The Empire's elite fleet, once thought to be an unstoppable force, was now scattered and leaderless. "Captain, they're retreating," the officer at the scanners reported. "The remaining ships are breaking formation. They're trying to escape." Eris felt a surge of satisfaction, but she didn't let it show. She had led her crew through this battle, and now she had one final order to give. "Chase them down," she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "We finish this now. We don't let them regroup." The Vanguard surged forward, its weapons still active, targeting the stragglers of the Empire's fleet. The remaining ships didn't stand a chance. One by one, the Empire's forces fell. What had once seemed like a hopeless fight was now a crushing victory for humanity. As the last of the Empire's ships was reduced to debris, Eris allowed herself a brief moment of relief. The battle was over. The Vanguard had faced the might of the Galactic Empire's elite fleet and emerged victorious. And with that victory, humanity had proven that they were no longer a species to be underestimated. The crew of the Vanguard celebrated, their spirits lifted by the impossible feat they had just accomplished. They had won against all odds. They had shown the galaxy that humanity's strength, resolve, and courage were unmatched. "We did it," one of the officers said, a grin spreading across his face. "We actually did it." Eris didn't smile, but she allowed herself a small nod. This victory was just the beginning. The Empire had been forced to reckon with humanity's power, but there was still much to be done. The galaxy had witnessed the strength of a single human ship, and Eris knew that this was only the first step in what would become humanity's rise. With the Empire's fleet shattered and their forces in disarray, humanity's secret armada had proven that they could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest powers in the galaxy. And if the Empire thought this was the end, they were in for a rude awakening. The Vanguard turned toward the horizon, ready for the next battle, knowing that they had already changed the course of history. Humanity had won, and the galaxy would never be the same again.